This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Abbott and Costello. We'll be looking at their careers and their lives with an expert in the field, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is American comedians Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, their comedy team, which dominated the 1940s in American comedy film. And I have Glenn Andreev, who is an expert on the lives and careers of Abbott and Costello. And so, welcome, Glenn. I like to give people a few minutes to tell a little bit about themselves. So, if you can give a little background about yourself, how you got to watch the Abbott and Costello films, and if you belong to any societies or anything devoted to them.
Okay, good morning, Dan. Well, I'm a filmmaker and film historian. I just finished a documentary on lost films called Lost Emulsion. And I guess growing up in Long Island, the New York area, they played Abbott and Costello films on television on WPIX Channel 11 at 11:30 every Sunday morning. So around this time 40 years ago, we'd be tuning in and watching an Abbott and Costello film.
Yeah. And I know I grew up in the New York area too, so my dad and I would come home from church and we'd always watch the Abbott and Costello movies. What specifically drew you to Abbott and Costello versus, say, some of the other comedy teams that were around that era, Laurel and Hardy or the Marx Brothers or Martin and Lewis?
Well, I became, I guess, a fan of all the comedians, Laurel and Hardy, Marx Brothers, the ones that were being repeated on television at the time. So, you're just drawn into this period of about 40, 50 years earlier, and just really clicking with the comedy style.
So let's talk a little bit about Abbott and Costello. They were both guys who were in vaudeville. They started out in vaudeville, and then they moved over to radio, and then eventually into film. Tell me a little bit about both of their backgrounds, Abbott and Costello, where they came from. Did they come from poverty? Did they come from good families? And how did they get involved in vaudeville?
Well, apparently, Lou Costello came from, I'd say, a very good family. I got to know on Facebook his daughter, Chris Costello, so I got a little background from her. And I think Lou had a sort of head start on film before Bud Abbott did, because Lou went out to Hollywood in the late 20s to seek superstardom. And he worked as a extra. You'll see him in a Laurel and Hardy short called Battle of the Century, which is considered one of their best comedy shorts of the silent era. And then he did extra work on a epic done at MGM called The Trail of 98, made in 1928, where he catches on fire and leaps out of a window. Well, one of the lead characters catches on fire and leaps out of a window, but that stunt was done by Lou Costello, who actually injured himself doing it. His name at the time was Lou, I'm not sure if I got the right pronunciation, Costello. And he became friends with an actress at the time, Dolores Costello. There's no relation whatsoever. She was a silent movie actress. She was married to John Barrymore for a while. And, she said, just go back to New Jersey and hone your craft as a comedian and, a physical comedian, and then come back. So he followed her advice, started driving back to New Jersey, broke down in Missouri, where he had to work in Missouri for a while to get enough funds to go back to New Jersey. And it's there he met Bud Abbott, and then history was made.
Well, they, as I said, started off as a vaudeville team. So once they met, did they then go touring around the country for how many years before they got onto radio and got named? Because they actually became famous for a lot of their verbal skits, like the most famous one being, Who's on First, were developed on radio. So how long did they toil, in comedy clubs or vaudeville and before they hit radio?
I would say for about 5 years, and they became pretty much one of the number one stars of radio in around 1939, 1940. And of course, Hollywood's going to call. And what's interesting about that Hollywood call, there's two Hollywood calls. There's one from Universal, the other one's from MGM. MGM wanted to put them in their upcoming film Ziegfeld Girl, which stars James Stewart and Lana Turner. And they would have, if they had gone with MGM, they would have been about 10th down the list, in the cast, and they would just had maybe very little screen time. And the problem with MGM is that it was run by Louis B. Mayer, who kept really strict control on all of their actors, especially their comedians. So comedians that were used to improvising, like the Marx Brothers or Buster Keaton, did not fare very well at MGM. So that could have been the fate of Abbott and Costello, but Universal came in with a larger amount of money and put them in a more prominent role but they're still supporting roles in Night at the Tropics, A Night in the Tropics, actually, and they're a clique, but they made an agreement with MGM that they would every so often they would do a film for MGM. So that's where you see films like Abbott and Costello in Hollywood.
Well, I've done shows previously about the Three Stooges and Laurel and Hardy. How did the Abbott and Costello routine differ from both of them? And obviously, there's a similarity to Laurel and Hardy in that there were two, and one was fat, one was thinner. But Laurel and Hardy, both guys were sort of comic foils for the other, whereas Abbott was definitely the straight man. He really wasn't the funny man. How did that develop about? Was that a conscious choice that Abbott was definitely the straight man?
Well, I think they took over from where Laurel and Hardy was was leaving. You have to understand, in around 1940, when it comes to screen comedians, your famous screen comedians like Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers, they're beginning to age. They're now, in their early 50s. They can't be as physical anymore. Their sort of vaudeville, the Marx Brothers vaudeville style is beginning to age a bit. So America just needed a new, fresh comedy team. So Abbott and Costello came in right at the right time, and they kind of took off where Laurel and Hardy, was beginning to just sort of wane. To give a good comparison, there's another comedy team from the early 1940s, Olsen and Johnson. Have you ever heard of them?
I've heard of them, but I don't think I've ever seen them.
Oh, they're actually very funny, but and when you see them, they kind of look like they're very straight-laced, business suits, fedoras, no endearing qualities. I mean, they look like your banker gone berserk.
Mm-hmm.
They're very funny. They're generally very funny, but they're not endearing. I mean, they just look like these two middle-aged guys being very funny. Abbott and Costello, they're endearing. I mean, you feel sorry for Lou. You kind of see that this is sort of an acidic friendship, that Bud is always ripping off Lou, always conning him out of money. But yet, Bud would probably take a bullet for Lou.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, I think that really clicked with audiences at the time.
Well, one of the things that distinguishes Abbott and Costello from Laurel and Hardy is, other than the physical humor that Laurel and Hardy were noted for, because Laurel and Hardy started out as silent comedians before teaming up, they didn't really have a lot of verbal back and forth. Theirs was more visual, whereas Abbott and Costello did both. The back and forth exchanges, things like the Susquehanna Hat Company or Who's on First and numbers of other gags, were right up there with the best of Groucho Marx. How much of their routines, like the ones I mentioned, Susquehanna Hat or Who's on First, were things that they developed, and how much of those were older vaudeville routines that were merely refined or perfected by them?
Well, I think like let's take the Who's on First routine. They both Lou grew up in the sort of the working class community of Paterson, New Jersey, Bud in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and they kind of watched how their neighbors would talk. You know, something we don't do nowadays in the sort of digital Twitter era is we don't look out the window and watch people hang out at street corners. And we sort of developed these kind of like crazy routines, these arguments that people would get into that, like the Who's on First routine, that would just be this sort of funny word salad. And the Who's on First routine, that was being developed as early around 36 or 37 in one of their uncle's basements. They would just, at night they'd go down there and they'd try it out. And, they just got it completely perfected.
So let's talk about, you said that their first film, they just had a supporting role in 1940. What was that film? And then I know Buck Privates was the first one that they starred in.
Well, their first film appearance is a film called A Night in the Tropics. And it's basically a romantic comedy starring a big actor at the time, Robert Cummings. And it's kind of like these two cute couples. They travel down to the tropics, and they kind of like exchange, mates for the time. But in the background are these two guys who work in the hotel or casino, Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, and they're very funny. They do a little bit of the Who's on First routine. They do the Do you have 2/10 for a 5 routine?
Yeah.
In the film, and they're very funny. They're supported by William Frawley of I Love Lucy fame.
Yeah.
And what was happening was that there was a lot of fan mail coming in from all over the world to Universal saying, we need to see more of these guys. Why don't you do a movie with them? And before all this fan mail came in, Bud and Lou thought this was just a one-shot deal. They thought they were going to go leave California and then go back to do vaudeville and radio in New York. But just as they were leaving, they were saying, no, America wants you on film. Let's sign you up for a contract. So that's where Buck Privates came in. Yeah. And it's kind of interesting with Buck Privates that Universal, wanted, they said, let's give them the starring role in the film, but we're not too sure yet, so let's throw in the Andrews sisters and let's throw in some subplots in there, like a romantic subplot. So that's why in the first Abbott and Costello films, there's nothing wrong with it. You see a lot of these Andrews sister routines. And actually what happened was that the Andrews sisters and Abbott and Costello became very good friends.
Well, a lot of their routines rely on things like math, like there's the 7 times 13 equals 28 routine. There's the one where, if he married a girl, like if a girl is 5 years old and he's 25, how long would he have to wait till she passes him in age and whatnot? Did a lot of those routines, you think, go over the heads of some of the people during that day? Because some of them are really still fresh today.
No, I don't think they really went over people's heads. Like I said, it was just, they started out in radio, which is purely a verbal, a form of entertainment. So, like I said, one of the nice things about vaudeville, you could, embellish and shape. You can find out what gags are not getting laughs, what gags are getting laughs. You can test it out on the audience and see what direction the eventual form of the gag becomes.
Let's talk about some of the early films. Because during World War II, Abbott and Costello, from what I read, were probably the biggest names in Hollywood. Their films were doing the best. And it looks like from 1941 till the end of 45, it looks like they did over a dozen or so films. And those are sort of considered, I guess, the real classic ones there before they started doing Abbott and Costello Meet Whatever. What What would you say during the World War II period were some of their best films, and why?
My favorite Abbott and Costello film from that period is Who Done It.
Uh-huh.
It is. Have you've seen it, right?
I've seen virtually all of the Abbott and Costello films.
Okay. It is. It's just from start to finish. It's just pure Abbott and Costello. Um, there's no musical numbers interrupting anything, and it's beautifully directed by director of Universal Errol Kenton, who kind of gave it this sort of film noir, almost like horror movie look to some of the way he set up his lighting and camera angles, and it just moves at a very fast pace. There's that wonderful routine with William Bendix as a very tough New York City cop or detective with the handcuffs.
Yeah,
that's just great. It just every time I see that, just laughing. And sort of interesting side note that there was a rumor online that Lou Costello did not like that William Bendix was getting as much laughs or maybe even more laughs, and that he sort of barred William Bendix from working in any of their films ever since. That's total fabrication because Chris Costello said that William Bendix and his wife became really good friends of the family. It's just that William Bendix's schedule was so, overwhelming, he couldn't have time to do another Abbott and Costello film. Excuse me.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Andrews sisters, and I know that, like Laurel and Hardy, they were recurring players, actors who appeared in a handful of different films over the years. Was there a stock, backup, backing company, a stock, stock actors that appeared every so often in the films, and who were some of the actors that appeared the most?
Trying to think who really appears over and over. I guess a couple of times they use the same actors. Multiple. Mo Howard. A couple of times you see him in Abbott and Costello films.
You mean Shemp? Shemp.
Yeah, excuse me. Getting over a New York cold.
Yeah.
And trying to think. Mary Wilkes. You see in a couple of the films.
Yeah.
And just generally everybody who worked on an Abbott and Costello film, they had a good time working with them.
Now, let me just, before we move on to some of the later films, let me just ask about the rumors about the relationships between Abbott and Costello, because I remember, I think it was around 1980, there was a TV film done with Harvey Korman and Buddy Hackett as Abbott and Costello, and it was implied that basically that Lou was a real bastard and he treated Abbott like a load of crap. Eventually they did sort of split up, and I think Lou did a few films on his own. What was their relationship non-professionally? Were they friends, or were they just people that just sort of clocked in, punched the clock, they worked, they do the movies, and then went their separate ways?
They really clicked. They were really like brothers, according to Chris Costello. She addresses it. In fact, when the TV movie Bud and Lou came out, she was so incensed on how inaccurate the film was that's why she made it her sort of second career to bring about the real truth about Abbott and Costello. There was some arguments in the beginning about how they'd be billed, Abbott and Costello, or Costello and Abbott. I think the former rolls off the tongue better. And also, I believe at the time it was the standard that the straight man is billed above the comedian.
Yeah.
But, Laurel and Hardy sort of breaks that. So, no, they got along, from what I understand, very well. Lou's children always referred to him as Uncle Bud. What really was separating them is that Lou had a drinking problem. And, this really infuriated, not Lou, Bud. Bud had a drinking problem. And this really infuriated Lou. And that was one of the reasons why around 1955, Lou said, well, we just got to go our separate ways.
Uh-huh. Well, I've heard that Costello is also the fellow who was involved with the negotiations with the studios for whatever percentage they get of the films. Was he the more hands-on business guy in the duo?
I would think so. Oh, we got a visitor here. Let me,
Huh.
if I stand still enough, hold on. That's Theta, named for Theta Barra, another big movie star. Playing Theta. Okay. And Theta sort of wrecked my
There you go.
composition there. There you go. Okay. Yeah, he was more of the hands-on business person. He also had more of a choice on what was, what material they'd make into a film. So it was basically him. And I think it's kind of sad. You see, Abbott and Costello in the 40s. You figure Bud was born in 1896. 1895 as some biographers put. But anyway, that puts him right in the mid-40s. He'd be 50 years old, and he still is a young-looking man.
Yeah.
Almost like a leading man type. But then you get, like, overnight, like around 1950, and, in his face, he just falls apart. So I'm just wondering if that's really from the drinking.
Well, looking at the filmography, by the end, it looks like Buck Private's Come Home, which is, I guess, is a sequel to the original film. Let's see, he played the same characters. That's 1947. Around that time is, I guess, when their films started becoming less popular, and they went from being featured stars to sort of doing what you'd call B films, because it's right around then, 1948, it looks like, is the first Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And then you get about 6 or 7 Abbott and Costello Meet something or other films, and while there is some humor and there's fun there, they're sort of self-conscious, and they're not of the quality of the World War II vintage films. What did the duo sort of realize that their time had passed, and were they just trying to hang on to their movie stardom, or did they sort of embrace doing these films?
Well, what happened with Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein? You have to understand. Universal changed hands in 1946, and it became all of a sudden Universal International Pictures. And one of the understandings of like Universal International is that they wanted to become more of a prestige studio. They wanted to do more of these like A-list movies, so they bought in the rights for Laurence Olivier's Hamlet. And they didn't want to do any more of the B movies. They didn't want to do Abbott and Costello, even though that's a big moneymaker for them. They sort of put the squash on the horror cycle then around 1946, and there was this screenplay for a film called The Brain of Frankenstein that was going to be done as a straight horror film, and somebody had the bright idea: let's make this Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein. And at first, Lou did not like the screenplay at all. In fact, he said, "Gee, my little daughter, my little 5-year-old daughter, could write a better screenplay than this nonsense." So they refurbished it a bit, and they built it up, and finally the film was greenlighted. It became an enormous hit in 1948. So much so that Boris Karloff was approached to be in the film, and he didn't want to do it. He thought the film was too lowbrow for him, and he wanted to get away from this sort of thing. But then when he saw how successful Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein was, he chimed right in and did Abbott and Costello Meets the Killer Boris Karloff.
Yeah, it's interesting that Karloff has his name in the title along with them.
Yeah. Well, it's box office drawing.
Yeah.
As Hollywood has been for the past 100 years, it's they got dollar signs pasted on their eyes, and they just something's just going to make a lot of money, they're going to follow that trend.
Yeah.
So that's why you got Abbott and Costello Meets the Invisible Man, which has a lot of great sight gags in there. Abbott and Costello meets Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They go to Mars. Which ones am I leaving out? I know there's
The
the
Keystone Cops. They meet the Keystone
Keystone
Cops.
Cops,
They go to
and
Mars. Jekyll and Hyde. Then they had
the
Invisible
Mummy,
Man, Foreign Legion,
oh, the Foreign Legion. Yeah,
Captain Kidd.
I think Captain Kidd that was done at another studio.
It says in Warner Brothers. It says
Yeah, they were farming out to other studios. They did Jack and the Beanstalk, which um, I might add that there is a restoration of Jack and the Beanstalk being taken on. So, throw out your crusty-looking public domain copies you get at AutoZone, and wait for this one to come out because it's from a print from Lou Costello's collection. So that's going to look really nice, in the upcoming few months.
Now, I know that some of the films took a long time to come out onto DVD. One of them was Africa Screams. You talk about the WPIX. As a kid, I don't remember ever seeing Africa Screams on WPIX. Was there, and I know it only sort of got a lot of attention in terms of Abbott and Costello fanhood with sort of the DVD revolution of 15, 20 years ago. Was there some problem with the copyrights or anything? Why was that film not available for television for so many years?
It probably was not part of the package. That was, because these films are not individually sold to television. They're sold as a package.
Yeah.
One of the most famous is that Paramount sold pretty much their entire inventory to Universal. So that's why when you get the Marx Brothers Paramount movies, it's all on a Universal label.
Yeah.
So I know there was a problem. I don't know the ins and outs of it with It Ain't Hay from 1943. And that was never included in the Abbott and Costello packages or films that you'd see on PIX as a kid. And it was considered a lost Abbott and Costello film. And it wasn't really lost. I mean, they had a print. There was a battle as can they really show this? And it could be that one estate has the screenplay rights, the other estate has the music rights or the picture rights. The same thing happened to for the Marx Brothers film Animal Crackers.
Yeah.
For the longest time, that film couldn't be shown, but then they worked out all the legal work and they re-released that to theaters. I don't know if you remember seeing that back in 1974.
Yeah,
Animal Crackers came to theaters. But going back to It Ain't Hay, it was there were some legal problems with the film, and like I said, you could only see it in 16mm bootlegs. But those problems have worked out because in my box set of Abbott and Costello films, it's there, and I think their oddest, not their best, but their oddest film of the World War II era.
Now, I want to talk about some of the later films. We'll get to the television show they did a little bit later on. But by 1950, and excluding the Abbott and Costello meat films, it seems that the quality of the films really declined. We mentioned Africa Screams, and I've seen that now a handful of times. And, it's just a really crappy B film. Coming Round the Mountain, Jack and the Beanstalk, Dance with Me, Henry. These are really just... these are almost sub Three Stooges level films. You said how Lou had been disappointed with some of the screenplays for the first Meats film. Was by the time that these films came out, were they just doing it for the money, or was their work on the television show in the early 50s more important to them than their film career?
I think it's both because once again, their last film together, Dance with Me, Henry, was, I believe, United Artists. It was not Universal, and it, just really, just like I said, does not work very well. I saw it recently again, and I think they were focusing on television. The one thing Lou Costello really enjoyed was technology. Chris Costello wonders, had he been alive today, what would he be thinking of Skype, and what would he think of YouTube and Vimeo? because he just loved all this new, all these new toys, and he loved television because it was a way of them getting their vaudeville routines, back to a new audience.
Yeah. I only seen once or twice many years ago the Lone Costello film, 30-Foot Bride of Candy Rock, and that too was a really crappy film. It reminded me. It seemed almost as if they were going with this sort of Roger Corman kind of film, with the 30-Foot Bride and whatnot, and a magic formula or whatnot that she swallows. Had Costello not died, do you think he would have continued on in films, making these kinds of films? Because they just seem so inferior to what he had done earlier.
Okay, well, here's speed up. Theta sees I'm doing something. I'm doing something, so she's like, she's got to be a part of it.
Okay.
You can find it on YouTube. There's a if you get the name of it, it's like American Playhouse or Playhouse something, not Playhouse 90.
Yeah.
But it's a TV little mini movie that Lou did around 1959. I think it's his last appearance anywhere. This is after Candy Rock, and it's very funny. He plays like this. He's not the usual bumbling man-child he is in all of his films. He plays this mild-mannered plumber. I don't know if you've ever seen this.
Yeah.
Have you seen this?
I think I saw it years ago. It vaguely sounds familiar, but And
then what happens is that he gets this call from this woman to work on some pipes in the middle of the night. So he, tells his wife, "I have to go out. I'll probably be back in the morning." And it's a ruse from gangsters who had just robbed their big jewelry store in the morning, and they accidentally dropped all their jewelry down the drain in the sink in their hotel room. So the head of the thieves is played by Jonathan Harris of Lost in Space fame.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's becoming more familiar to you.
I know Jonathan Harris, yeah.
I know, but I mean the episode.
Again, vaguely. I mean, I was a big Abbott and Costello fan, so it's vague, but it's been many years.
Oh, well, check it out. He's, Lou Costello is spot on. He's doing an entirely different character, almost more like a Jack Lemmon type of character.
Mm.
And I think this was the direction Lou wanted to go. So if Lou had not died at the age of 52 or 53, he would have went on for maybe another 20 years, and he would have been doing different characters.
Mm.
You would have been seeing really different stuff. And then the same thing with Bud Abbott. After Lou's death, Bud had tried, some jobs in television, and there's a dramatic film. It's also on YouTube where he plays the agent for a sort of collapsing stand-up comic played by all people, Lee Marvin.
Huh.
And Bud's really good at it.
So do you think that Costello died, 20-some years before Abbott? Abbott lived until, 79? 71? What?
74.
74 he died, okay. Well, let me talk about, I want to talk about the television show, but I do want to also mention that I remember, and I was just looking it up, that there seemed to be a spoof of them done by Warner Brothers, and I remember that these little mice that were cats or whatnot. Were they authorized, or were they spoofs, and who voiced them?
I guess those were Mel Blanc and whoever was on the Warner Brothers team at the time. Again, they needed to make these cartoons quickly, so they wouldn't try to farm out voice talent. They would just go on their roster of voice talents they had at the studio. I'm not sure whether or not they had to actually get permission from Abbott and Costello, because I know nowadays the legal work's a lot different, because they'd be saying, well, you're making even though it's a cartoon image, you're making money off of our image, and you need to compensate us. So things I think were a lot looser then. So they probably didn't even go through that. But yeah, there's that. A Tale of Two Kitties. Yeah, that's it.
Well, let me ask about the television show, but just looking online here, it says that before they got their actual half-hour television sitcom, they were rotating hosts of the Colgate Comedy Hour, which was one of the early variety shows of that era. How did they get involved in television? Was it their waning fortune in film? What network approached them?
I'm really not sure what network approached them, but like I said, I know Lou really loved technology. In fact, when going back to Night in the Tropics and Buck Privates, in between takes, they would be wandering off to like the camera crew and the sound crew and looking at all the microphones and the sound recording equipment and the cameras. They were fascinated. So I think that's part of the reasons why Lou sort of gravitated the group towards television.
By the early 50s, too, it seems that Martin and Lewis had taken over as sort of the dominant comedy team in terms of box office. So do you think that were they happy that they were offered the television show, or was that something that they were wary of taking?
I think they were happy with it. I mean, you see it in the film, you see it in the television shows. They're very spontaneous. They're very natural. They're very much into it. I mean, you could tell when you can very often tell when a performer is just doing it for the paycheck, and just to keep the mortgage payments going. But here it's really spontaneous, and they're the people they just work with constantly. Like Stanley Fields is their landlord, and Joe Besser is Stinky. I mean, a lot of that is just comedy gold.
Yeah. Well, I know when I did the Three Stooges show, I talked about Joe Besser's role in the Abbott and Costello film because he played this sort of big crybaby kind of role. He was supposedly excuse me, a 6 or 7-year-old kid dressed up in this bizarre outfit from the turn of the 20th century. And the odd thing in the show, it seems like that their characters sort of mediated. Lou wasn't always the funny guy. A lot of times in the routines, Bud wasn't there at all, and was usually there were some of the best scenes in that series was between Besser and Lou. Was this a problem that Abbott was having this drinking problem, or did Costello sort of work better with Besser in those years? Because in those years, he's almost bullying Besser all the time.
Yeah, you think about it, there's like Bud would run off, and then Stinky would come in for a long time.
Yeah.
And, it's like, where's Bud? So, it could have been that maybe by then the drinking problems caused Bud to, forget his lines. So they said, "Oh, we'll just give him the minimal amount of work to do." So that could be it.
Yeah, I know Jerry Seinfeld back in the 1990s credited a lot of the inspiration for his show Seinfeld to Abbott and Costello, and it's one of the reasons I've never been a big Seinfeld fan is because even before Seinfeld admitted that, the show to me had very much of that same feel to it that the Abbott and Costello show did. The Abbott and Costello show. There wasn't really any character development. It was usually a series of skits. One of them would have some little scam to work out. Mike the cop would come along. They'd hide something. Stinky would find out about it, threaten to tell Mike the cop, that kind of thing. It was just a series of reworked gags, but they worked because, for the most part, I think because of the talents involved. Whereas with the Seinfeld people, I never really thought it was nearly as good. How influential do you think that the television show of Abbott and Costello was on later television sitcoms?
I think it is very influential because they said one of the endearing traits of Abbott and Costello is that they are, they're these sympathetic characters. There's the one TV episode I remember where they throw a party, and Lou thinks he's putting antipasta sauce or cream on crackers, but it's actually ant paste, and it makes all the party guests sick. And he becomes sort of the town reject that nobody wants anything to do with him when he made this very innocent mistake. So there we're feeling very sorry for him, and I think that really helps the comedy along. I mean, it sort of goes back to Chaplin, and of course Lou Costello was a big fan of Charlie Chaplin, and I think another thing that why Abbott and Costello TV series sort of resonates today, why people still find it very funny, is that it has this like very bizarre sense of humor. I mean, it's like, here's Joe Besser is Stinky. He must be about 60 years old, and he's dressed as like a 6-year-old. And nobody says, is there something wrong with this man? Why is he dressed like that? And everybody just accepts this is this like overgrown child. And there's also one bit I like in there where they have to get up Bud and Lou have to get up $5 like really quick. And even in 1952, that's the equivalent of maybe $60 today. So there's Bud in his fedora, suit and tie, looking like he could work corporate. And he says, "I'll look for some odd jobs for us." And it's like, wow, you guys have to do this for this little bit amount of money.
Yeah.
And it's never really explained why, but I think that's part of the humor.
Did the television show, it only lasted 2 seasons, was it canceled because of low ratings, or what happened?
That I'm really not too sure of. I know, it was very popular. Maybe they just felt that their routines were not, where, they couldn't think of any more new routines. I think that was one of the ingredients that ended their film career in '55, was that Lou was beginning to see the emergence of new comedians, rougher comedians like Lenny Bruce. And he said, well, this is the direction American comedy is going towards, and we don't want, any part of that sort of like what they thought was very crude humor. It's sort of like, very offensive humor. So I think they just sort of said, let's just end it now and let's cut it off.
Well, you mentioned WPIX. I know with the Three Stooges, towards the end of their career, when after Shemp Howard died, and then they replaced him with Besser and then Joe DeRita, it was television which revived the career of the Three Stooges with a syndicated package that went around the country for the shorts that they did. Now, even though the television show failed, certainly the Abbott and Costello films, as you had mentioned, were then sort of packaged, and big chunks of the films were packaged to stations like WPIX. When did this occur, and did this revive interest in Abbott and Costello? Was this the early '60s or so?
I'd say it's the early '60s when you're beginning to see all these packages come together, and now new audiences are taking it in, and especially children on a Sunday morning around this time of the morning. There's nothing to do on television. It may be too cold to go outside, but there's these two really funny guys on television. I think there was also packages for the Marx Brothers at W.C. Fields, and these are kind of like anti-authority, anti-establishment type of people, and you have that whole counter-revolution that's coming in the late '60s, and they're just embracing Marx Brothers movies like Duck Soup. So there's just this like a whole brand new audience. So
let me just talk about the critical reception of Abbott and Costello. Where have they sort of ranked? I mean, when they first did their first starring film, Buck Privates, that was a hit financially, but were they sort of looked at as lowbrow vaudevillians? Were they sort of looked up to? Were they seen as successes to Laurel and Hardy, or how were they viewed, and how did it change over time?
Well, I think the more responsible critics at the time, they just knew there's an audience for it. Um, they would rather be, gloating over the marvels of Orson Welles or John Ford or Alfred Hitchcock at the time. But, they just said, okay, there's an audience for these films, and, they're going to make money. And they kind of, critics recognized there's an audience, and we need to tell that audience, this is a good Abbott and Costello film, or this is a great Abbott and Costello film, or this is just or another one, this is a rehash of their other routines, don't bother. So, I guess they kind of knew that, okay, this isn't high art, this isn't genre noir, or, they just know this, it is what it is.
Well, I mentioned Martin and Lewis having sort of taken over the mantle in the early 50s from Abbott and Costello in terms of being the top comedy draw. But then after Martin and Lewis's career faded and they sort of split up, there really haven't been comedy teams. Do you think that the film comedy team, I mean, and I'm not just talking about pairing up for one or two films like Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor, but I mean a real comedy team like the Laurel and Hardys, like the Marxes, like the Stooges, like Abbott and Costello or Martin and Lewis. Do you think that that's a time that just has passed, or do you think that that kind of humor, I mean, certainly it would have to be a bit more sophisticated for the 21st century, could work today, or do you think that's just something that's gone by?
I think it is kind of gone by. I mean, you see little bursts of it every now and again. Of course, in the 60s and 70s, you have Rowan and Martin, you have Cheech and Chong, and I think it's a lot of these comedians just kind of like working on their own. Occasionally they'll bring a successful teaming back. I believe there was a repairing of Peter Falk and Alan Arkin after The In-Laws. And the two of them worked so beautifully well in that film. And I think Steve Martin would work with sometimes the same person, every now and again, but not as a team.
Well, let's end this segment, and in the final segment, I want to just talk about where do you think their place in history is, and any of the future. So we'll do that in a moment. I've been speaking with Glenn Andreev about the career of Abbott and Costello. LostEmotion.com is his website. I'll link to it below. I just want to wrap up the interview and ask about where do you think Abbott and Costello rank in terms of comedy film history? Do you put them on a par with Laurel and Hardy or the Marxes? Do you think they're better than them? And where do most film historians rank them?
It's really hard to compare them. I mean, it's like comparing it's like pizza to fish or something like that. It's because the Marx Brothers was more this, like I said, anarchaic, antisocial humor. Abbott and Costello was more this like vaudeville, sort of at the time innocent sort of humor, and all comedians are very different, and that's what makes them so wonderful. So I think they're one of the the top comedians. I'd like to end with a little story that happened about 3 weeks ago. I put together a program for a senior living facility of all-day horror movies for Halloween, starting early in the morning and going on in the evening. And of course, these are seniors. I can't show Cannibal Holocaust or Make Them Die Slowly or something like that. Right? So I carefully chose about 6 or 7 films. There was the original War of the Worlds, The Invisible Man with Claude Rains, the original King Kong, and in there was Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein. So I'm there, and then this nurse, who's about 21 years old, wheels in her patient, this woman in her 70s, and the nurse sits down right next to me, and we're watching Psycho, and she's like, "What is this?" I said, "This is Psycho. Have you ever heard of it?" She's like, "No." I said, "Well, it's directed by a very famous man, very famous director who did suspense and horror, Alfred Hitchcock." "No." And so the next film is Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein. Have you heard of them? So she sticks around. I put on Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein. She is cracking up at the back and forth between Bud and Lou and Lon Chaney Jr., where he says, at midnight I turn into a wolf. Yeah, you and 20 million other guys. She's laughing away, and I'm hoping that night she went on YouTube, she went on Wikipedia, whatever, and she's looking up Abbott and Costello. So, I mean, I think the new generation will embrace them.
Well, let me just end by asking you. You'd mentioned lostemotion.com, your website, and it looks like you're trying to preserve old films. Tell me a little bit about that venture.
Well, that was a sort of a labor of love that I started about 2 years ago, about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And it's all about all the films that have been lost since the invention of cinema in the late 1890s. And it's usually due to nitrate decomposition, or for some reason the films were purposely destroyed because studios just didn't want to have these like warehouses full of volatile nitrate film. So they figured there was no new audiences. I mean, I think people in the 1940s would be perplexed that audiences in the 20-teens would love Abbott and Costello. Luckily, none of their films have been destroyed. So it's kind of like what's lost. And it's also stuff that gets sort of like just tucked away in the wayside. Another comedy team from the early 30s who were as popular as the Marx Brothers and Laurel and Hardy and W.C. Fields was Wheeler and Woolsey.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen
them? Yeah.
And their shtick was they were kind of like more adult humor. There was like sort of these sex gags in there that they would do. And this was before the censorship became very much more harsh in 1934. And their films were very popular, but so then when it came to the packaging of these comedy teams to television in the early 60s, they're looking at Wheeler and Woolsey and saying, no, we can't have kids see this. No, they'll never get it. So they were not packaged. They were not repackaged. So there was no new audience. So, like I said, Wheeler and Woolsey, they just sort of became tucked aside. And luckily their films have survived. They're not as good as the Marx Brothers, but they're fun. You definitely won't have a bad time with Wheeler and Woolsey. But I think Abbott and Costello, I think they will just, 80 years from now, they're going to be watching Buck Privates, even when they forgot what World War II is.
Well, let me close by asking you two things. One, what is your favorite Abbott and Costello film? And two, what do you think was their best film, if it's not your favorite?
I would say my favorite is Who Done It, because it's so spontaneous and it's so wild and it's just nonstop. And I think their best made film is Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein, because they were really trying new things with the monster makeup, especially with Lon Chaney. And it's really well shot. There's these wonderful process shots of the castle, and it really just, as a movie, it works.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for spending some time talking about Abbott and Costello. I will link to your website, lostemotion.com, below. Anyone can click there to find out more information. So thanks again, Glenn.
All right, Dan. Thank you.